predisposition, it's like playing a lottery, you might win. In this aspect, what we are trying to say is that the Ulyssess syndrome, these are individuals who do not have a mental illness history or predisposition, and they are faced with stressors that affect them. Therefore, there are symptoms, but this does not mean that they are depressed. If there is no vulnerability, you will not see this syndrome. But a lot of people live situations, very harsh situations, in the Ulyssess syndrome. Some probably end up with a mental illness, but may our God do not send all of the evil that we are unable to overcome. And this is an example of the situation. Very well. So the Ulyssess syndrome has to do more with the prevention area in the mental health system, not really the treating of the mental health field. Really, here's where the social workers and other professionals really need to concentrate more in the social intervention in programs and systems in which intervene and prevent this. Two metaphors in the Ulyssess syndrome is as if, for example, we would increase the Fahrenheit in this room, that would affect us. If we increase the temperature, we would feel the dizziness, and we would start feeling maybe the heat. But if we left the room and went outside, then we would no longer feel that. But that does not mean we are ill. If somebody has a heart problem, or somebody has a problem with their kidneys and he suffers something right now, then that's because he had a previous situation. But the majority of us would just leave the room and no longer feel those symptoms. Or as if that weed that is now bent by the wind but does not break, as a metaphor. So the idea is that the Ulyssess syndrome is in the middle between the mental health and the mental health illness. It's not that he is not suffering, but what he is suffering is not necessarily an illness. What do they do? Medicalize or trivialize? Oh, okay, well, that's his problem. Then he's saying, well, no. He is at risk that this may turn into a mental illness. Everybody can only bear so much. It's a multiple chronic stress, very intense, but it's really in between. We have to reflect upon this. The diagnosis is a complex diagnosis, has very difficult elements. We must use our judgment and be prudent while doing the evaluation, social, ethnical, cultural. This work from Foucault, a French philosopher who worked somewhat on the psychiatry aspect and how it's very powerful, and people start to intervene in a very inappropriate way in the life of the individuals. So Foucault would say that those who are excluded are the locusts and the prisoners, and also the immigrants are those new radicals that are being excluded, that group that is has been completely excluded. This was not entirely the case in Foucault's time in 1970, and this is one of his books that talks about this. And there's been judges in Spain who have taken in consideration the Ulyssess syndrome as an extenuating circumstances in certain circumstances, because even though he is not ill, this situation has brought about a certain situation, and so it's interesting how they've really acknowledged this. So I will sum up this, saying that we have to really humanize the migration and see the human side of migration. I think that this is something that we are not very much taking into consideration. We talk about data, statistics, but very little about the human touch. There's certain Sloterdijk and other philosophers that were against this humanizing, and others who were more in favor of humanizing this aspect of migration. Very briefly, we have a scale that we have used in the psychopathological and the Ulyssess syndrome in a specific area I will talk about tomorrow, but I will explain it very, very briefly because I've already pointed out the concepts. First, the type of grief that I've spoken about, the 7 grievances, and the intensity of the grief that I have already talked about, simple, complicated, or extreme, and also in third, the vulnerability and the stressors and all of the elements of the scale. I have shown the 7 grievances, the intensity, the vulnerability of the subject, and the problems in which he is faced with the society where he arrives. We have a graph here of the scale that helps us analyze more than 100 variables at the same time of each immigrant and see each grieve, the problems and the history and the present issues or problems and the potential in which he is faced, or the risk. For example, the language. If we have an individual who has dyslexia, aphasia, or unable to read and write, obviously he will have more difficulty trying to read and write the language. But if he is in a good condition, and it's going to be much easier for him to learn English. Very different as if he is isolated in a barn. So simple when the conditions are good, complicated when the conditions are difficult, and extreme when the situations are such that he cannot overcome the situation. So different variables in the migration, and where is it that we have to intervene, and what are the areas that work and what are the areas that do not work. And we use a system in which we highlight yellow, red, green, and so we highlight in which areas are simple, they would be green, complicated in yellow, and extreme highlighted in red. And so we would see where are the problems of the immigrant, the intensity of these, and with the very few resources that we have, we try to intervene just where we need to intervene. Sometimes we intervene just a little bit. When everybody's chasing the ball and the kids are playing, we want to make sure that we identify the problem, provide the resource. We are able to compare several cases and see who is in more need. Sometimes we provide more assistance to that one who is probably, we hear crying out more for help, but we really have to see, and we would be happy of working also with the colleagues here and trying to figure out how to provide those resources, not only in the psychiatry level, but really social workers, the counselors, and in the school sites. This is a book that I published. I've left a sample here at the clinic. If you are interested, Jose and Linda can offer that book. Very well. The intervention aspect we will talk about tomorrow. And so why is it that I called this the Ulyssess syndrome? What does Ulyssess have to do with all of this? I think that the reason why I use Ulyssess is because I wanted to honor the role of the immigrant. He was they do heroic things, really. There's no acknowledgement. While reading the Odyssey, you know, the adventures, and if you have someone who is living this, a common person close to you, to really honor the figure of the immigrant, and really so we understand the emotional aspect, and try to draw close to this emotional aspect, not all technical. And also the Odyssey speaks about the trips of the immigrants, and the specialists in the Odyssey, as in Paris, in the Greek culture, they said that it's a poem of immigrants, the Odyssey, of great migrations, in which a Ulyssess really was a symbol of the difficulties and the difficult of this migration. This is a text of the Odyssey. Those who we listen to crying, those that anguish, not seeing really an escape to their problems. And so the rupture between the family, the separation of the family, that really anguish and that fear, and really those tears, that concern, that suffering of the mother, the wife, and the son really leaves looking for the father who they've not seen for years, and they are concerned for. The Odyssey is really a universal myth. The Hindu really has acknowledged the symbol of this Odyssey in other parts of the world. In any culture, they understand the Ulyssess myth, and also San Basilio, San Ignacio de Antioquia, San Policarpo de Smyrna, the fathers, spoke that Ulyssess, for those who did not have a Bible, was a pioneer of Christ, one who prepared the coming of the Messiah. Figures that he's been an image, a model of conduct, of struggling for his family, for his loved ones. And in this trip of this immigrant from El Cameroon, the center of Africa, crosses all of the Sahara Desert, a terrible, thousands and thousands of kilometers, until he reaches Argelia, the north of Africa. And in each one of these points, he is faced with being threatened, trying to survive, just imagine. And so he continues the south coast of Africa to the Canary Islands, and he is hiding there for a long time until he is able to cross in a small boat to Spain. And he is then in jail for several months, and then finally to the peninsula. This is a voyage that takes years. Ulyssess crossed from the coast of Turkey to the coast of Greece, a very small voyage in comparison with the Odyssey that many are faced now. We are not exaggerating while we say this. We are not exaggerating when we say that we are now seeing really these terrible voyages and Odysseys from the Philippines, and crossed all of the Pacific coast to get to Canada, 10,000 kilometers. And we see here that people are trying to survive in terrible situations while migrating. The Odyssey also speaks about this Ulyssess in this Odyssey, but it was a man. Now we see millions and millions of people who are facing and living this, and Ulyssess was really a semi-god. But now we see common people living what the heroes used to live. We are really living difficult times, right? Now we see a common people, human beings living with the heroes. 2 days Ulyssess was at sea. The boat was wrecked in a shipwreck, but now there's been so many who have been for days in shipwrecks at sea. And so the dangers, and so just like in the Odyssey, they used to take something to forget the concerns and the problems. Now we spoke about the problem of people drinking and falling into alcoholism, evil eye, sorcery.